Your outside experts have assumed that your tax plan would cut would cost $5 trillion. As somebody who spent a couple years, as you know, trying to wrestle with these numbers and took on entitlement reform, took on additional revenues, I don't think there's any way you can get there with elimination of tax expenditures, particularly when you take charitable, home mortgage, and retirement accounts off the table. There's just, there aren't enough tax deductions to get to those numbers, unless you're going to, I imagine you're now saying you're going to go ahead and dramatically cut back on the deductibility of employer-provided health care plans. That's a large number.
I'm sorry, sir. Specific question I was making.
The specific question is, you got $5 trillion in cost in your tax plan,
right,
unpaid for. You cannot pay for it in any revenue-neutral basis without double or triple counting or dynamic scoring on steroids if you take charitable, home mortgage, and retirement accounts off the table is not being cut.
Right.
You can't get there. The numbers do not add up. I applaud your efforts to try to make our tax code more rational and try to lower corporate rates, do repatriation. I spent a couple years in this process and took some arrows from my own team in terms of willing to look at entitlements, but also look at net new revenues. I just got to tell you, sir, the nonpartisan CRFB, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, has estimated that your tax cuts in your outline would add about $5 trillion to the deficit over the coming decade. And with what you've answered to Senator Casey and Senator Brown, when you take charitable, home mortgage, retirement accounts, and some of these others off the table, you can't get $5 trillion in savings.
And I assure you, when we come out with all the details, there'll be full transparency. This will be scored by joint tax, as well as lots of outside groups, as well as we will provide our own view of the scoring. We have over 100 people in the tax department looking at lots of different scenarios, and we're working hard on that. We have no intention of doing something that would add trillions of dollars to the debt.
Well, especially since, right now at $20 trillion, as interest rates go up, for 100 basis points, again, we discussed this before, that adds just an additional debt service, $140 billion a year in additional payments right off the top. So, I would argue you balloon the debt, and whatever benefit you get from the tax cut is going to be erased by the additional deficit payments.
Senator Warner, I assure you that we appreciate the significance of the debt having gone from $10 trillion to $20 trillion.
And again, both sides bear responsibility. All I would say, sir, is I've spent a couple of years looking through these numbers pretty closely. I think based on reasonable, normal assumptions with anything close to traditional scoring, even if you do a little bit of bump on dynamic scoring, you can't get to $5 trillion of tax expenditures without going after the largest ones like employer-based health care. I really fear that this becomes a lot harder than it looks, and I am worried if you is around the 3% growth rate assumptions. I'll look more. I'm worried as well about dynamic scoring that has to include the tax cut assumptions, and yet you're then saying they're not counted in the budget, so there does seem to be, again, double counting. I'm also very worried that we're taking domestic discretionary spending down to 3% of GDP. That's the lowest it's ever been. And, we were both business guys. You invest in a business, if a business invests in education, plant and equipment, and staying ahead of the competition, a government does that by investing in education, infrastructure, and research and development. And unfortunately, your budget slashes investments in education, infrastructure, and research and development. That's not going to lead, I believe, to the kind of growth that you have in your underlying assumptions. I've seen lots of tricky budgets before, but this may take the cake. You assume abolishment of the so-called death tax, estate tax, but when you go to your table S3, baseline by category, you still count the revenues from the estate and gift tax, which is kind of a tricky thing. I would call that double counting. I don't think you've told the American public yet that to even get close, you're going to have to then take off the deductibility of employer-provided health care plans. So that's on the table?
Here's what's on the table, which is I think the one-page set of principles that we sent
Sir,
up to the Hill.
I've gone
a couple
through
weeks
these.
ago.
I know you have as well.
Right.
I spent years going through these numbers to try to get them to balance. You got to go where the money is if you're talking about any kind of rational revenue neutral plan. And I don't think you can get there. And I don't think your numbers add up. I think they don't pass the smell test. And I think, frankly, what Senator Whitehouse was pushing at, that you were not double counting, I just don't believe that as well, because you have put dynamic scoring in place.